That day in August of 2001, that day, the mountains swallowed her whole. It wasn't the kind of disappearance that offered even the faintest shimmer of a trail. No discarded backpack, no cryptic note scrawled on a map. There was only the silent, yawning void where a vibrant young woman, 23-year-old Shelly Carpenter, had been just hours before. She had driven her faded blue Honda Civic to the vast, unforgiving expanse of the San Juan National Forest in Colorado. She parked it meticulously at the trailhead, a small act of order before stepping into chaos. Her plan, documented in a journal she had left behind, was a simple, solitary trek, a quiet communion with the towering peaks before the pressures of the world descended once more. But the world she left for her hike was the last she would ever truly inhabit. Days bled into a week, and the Civic remained a rusting sentinel of her absence. The authorities were called, and the initial search began, a monumental effort born of hope and fueled by dread. Helicopters, their rotors, slicing the thin mountain air, scoured the dense pine forests and rocky slopes, their eyes straining to catch a flash of color that did not belong. Search and rescue teams, some local, some flown in from across the state, traversed every ravine, every creek bed, and every sun-drenched meadow within a 10-mile radius. Yet the wilderness offered nothing but its own impenetrable silence. Shelly Carpenter had, for all intents and purposes, simply ceased to exist. The early stages of the investigation were plagued by a desperate uncertainty. Was it a tragic accident? A slip on a treacherous scree field? Her body swallowed by the deep folds of the earth? The San Juans were a dangerous playground, known for sudden, violent weather shifts in terrain that punished the inexperienced. Or was it something darker, something predicated on malice? The very idea felt somehow incongruous with the setting. The wilderness was supposed to be a place of honest, elemental danger, not the clandestine acts of men. Yet the possibility hung over the search like a shroud. The investigators, a weary, determined group, led by the unflappable Sheriff Dale Hansen, had to pursue every thread, no matter how frayed. They spoke to her family, who clung to the fading image of their daughter, her laughter still echoing in their quiet home. They learned of her passion for photography, her deep appreciation for the majesty of the natural world. They scrutinized her movements leading up to the hike. The gas station attendant who remembered her distinct silver necklace, the cafe owner who recalled her order, a single black coffee. Every detail was cataloged, yet none of it could offer a geographical fix, a tangible direction in which to turn. The search eventually scaled down, as all mountain searches inevitably must. The money ran out. The volunteers became exhausted, and the cruel reality of the odds settled in like a cold, persistent fog. Shelly Carpenter became a face on a milk carton, a name whispered in the hushed, regretful tones of a local tragedy. The case went cold, archived in a heavy bound ledger as a probable missing person presumed deceased due to environmental exposure or an unrecoverable accident. The narrative seemed closed, a heartbreaking but ultimately simple conclusion. A hiker alone had underestimated the mountains and paid the ultimate price. But that was the story told for 4 long, agonizing years. The true story, the one that would tear open old wounds and reveal a layer of terror no one had ever suspected, was patiently waiting. It was waiting in a place no search team would ever have thought to look. It was tucked away, hidden from the world, a secret kept inside a small, battered piece of footwear. The years passed, marked by the changing seasons in the San Juans. The sun bleached the peaks, and the snow buried the trails. The old blue Civic was sold at auction, and the trailhead sign was eventually replaced, a fresh marker over a buried memory. The Carpenter family, shattered but resilient, had learned to live with the unanswerable question, the gnawing absence that defined their every day. Then came October 2005, a month that began like any other, but ended with a discovery so shocking, so utterly out of place, that it would instantly resurrect the case and force the world to confront the terrifying truth of Shelly Carpenter's last moments. It was not a professional search team that made the finding, nor was it a trained investigator. It was an amateur metal detectorist, Ethan Wells, an unassuming man with a hobby and a keen eye for historical artifacts, who was combing a remote, rarely trafficked section of the forest, a section well outside the initial search grid. He was not looking for a missing person. He was looking for lost relics of the old mining boom. What he found instead was a single, worn hiking boot. It was half buried in the soil, partially concealed by a thicket of scrub oak, its leather stiffened by 4 years of brutal exposure. It was undeniably hers. The size matched the inventory taken from her home, and a small, almost imperceptible tear near the ankle confirmed it matched the description given by her sister. The discovery itself was significant enough, a piece of evidence finally pulled from the void, but what lay inside the boot, what it had been sheltering for all that time, was the key that would unlock the door to a truth too painful to comprehend. The seasoned investigators, veterans of countless tragedies, understood the profound implication of the find. A solitary boot, detached from the body, suggested either a desperate struggle or a final, intentional act. It was Sheriff Hansen who, with a meticulous care that belied his rising panic, oversaw the extraction of the boot from the earth. The moment he held it, he knew this was no simple accident. The boot felt heavy, unbalanced. He gently, cautiously examined the lining, and there it was, tucked deep inside the insole, almost invisible to the naked eye. A small piece of the digital age had been shielded from the elements. It was a memory card, a small square of plastic and metal, no larger than a thumbnail. The card was carefully sealed in an evidence bag, the air in the remote forest clearing thick with a sudden, suffocating anticipation. This tiny artifact, rusted on the edges, yet potentially still functional, represented 4 years of lost time and an entire, unwritten final chapter of Shelley's life. The mystery of the missing hiker had just violently and irreversibly shifted. The story of a tragic accident was dead. The silence had been broken, and the truth, whatever its horrific nature, was about to speak. The card, once a passive storage device, was now an active ticking bomb, and the investigators braced themselves for the explosion of information it was poised to deliver. The question that hung in the cold mountain air was no longer where was Shelly Carpenter, but what had happened to her, and what terrible secret was held captive on that fragile piece of electronics. The discovery of the memory card changed everything, transforming a cold case of probable misadventure into a live, active, and deeply disturbing investigation. The urgency was palpable. The card was flown immediately to a specialized forensic lab in Denver, where technicians faced the delicate task of retrieving data that had been exposed to the harsh mountain environment for over 48 months. The hours they spent were a torture for the Carpenter family and the investigators alike. Every whir of a hard drive, every flicker of a screen represented a potential portal back to the final, terrifying moments of Shelley's life. The initial prognosis was grim. Water damage, temperature fluctuations, and the sheer length of time suggested the data might be corrupted beyond retrieval. But then, a quiet cheer from the lab floor. Success. The data was fractured but recognizable. The memory card held not cryptic notes or journal entries, but images. Over 200 digital photographs had survived the long, silent vigil inside the hiking boot. These weren't the vacation snapshots the family might have hoped for. They were something far more profound, far more unsettling. The investigators began the slow, methodical process of viewing the recovered images, and as the photos flashed onto the large evidence screen, the simple narrative of a lost hiker was not just complicated, it was annihilated. The first sequence of images seemed innocuous enough, even beautiful. They captured the beginning of her trek, wide-angle shots of majestic peaks, the clear blue sky, the texture of the ancient pines. These were the photos of a confident, skilled nature photographer, full of light and life. Shelley was documenting her journey, capturing the essence of the freedom she sought. The chronological order, reconstructed by the EXIF data embedded in the image files, was crucial. It provided a meticulous, terrifying timeline. The picture suddenly shifted in tone, the vibrant colors giving way to a more tense, claustrophobic atmosphere. The sweeping landscapes were replaced by close-ups, a strange, hastily built cairn of rocks that didn't match local indigenous markers, the broken branch of a white birch that seemed to have been snapped with excessive force, and then a series of images that made the blood run cold. They were self-portraits, but not the cheerful selfies of a casual hiker. Shelley's face, once beaming, was now etched with palpable anxiety. Her eyes were wide, constantly looking over her shoulder. The camera had become a shield, a silent witness she could deploy against an unseen threat. One particular image was difficult to look at, a shot taken at dusk, her hand obscuring part of the lens, her expression a mask of unadulterated fear. It was the portrait of a woman who knew, with a dreadful, certain knowledge, that she was not alone. The linear progression of the photos revealed a story of an encounter that began with unease and quickly escalated to sheer terror. The timeline indicated a rapid change in her path. She was no longer following the trail, but deliberately moving off it, scrambling through dense underbrush. This explained why the original search had failed. She had gone entirely off-grid, seeking refuge or escape in the most inaccessible parts of the forest. The climax of the photographic evidence arrived with a cluster of 5 images, taken in rapid succession. The quality was poor, shaky, suggesting a frantic movement. They were photographs of something being thrown or dropped, or perhaps even used as a defensive weapon. The final image in the sequence was a blur of earth, shadow, and a small, unrecognizable metallic object. Then, 4 years of silence. The narrative was clear. Shelly Carpenter had not simply slipped and fallen. She had been running, she had been hunted, and at some point, knowing her life was likely forfeit, she had undertaken a final, desperate act of communication. She had taken the memory card from her camera, removed her boot, and tucked the evidence away, sealing her last testament inside a vessel of leather and rubber, praying that one day someone, anyone, would find it. It was a singular, profound act of courage and forethought in the face of absolute dread. The investigation, now breathing with new life, focused entirely on the details within the photographs. The investigators, re-energized, haunted by the images of Shelley's fear, began to dissect every pixel. The metallic object in the final blurry photograph became the focal point. Through painstaking digital enhancement, the lab was able to pull a clearer image, and what emerged from the digital fog was not a weapon, not a tool, but a small, uniquely carved silver pendant. It was a piece of jewelry with an intricate, almost tribal design, something a person would wear consistently. This pendant was the crucial clue. It was not hers. It was a relic of the other person in her final narrative, the one who had driven her into the heart of the wilderness and extinguished her young life. The focus immediately shifted from locating Shelley to identifying the owner of that pendant. The silver object was a ghost signature of her assailant. The emotional weight on the investigative team was immense. They were no longer simply looking for a body. They were hunting a killer who had been living freely for 4 years, a predator who had melted back into the vast, anonymous landscape. The forest that had once been the primary suspect was now merely the crime scene, a silent, majestic witness to an act of ultimate violence. With the photographic evidence and the image of the pendant, the search area was narrowed with surgical precision. Using the geospatial data in the photos, the angle of the sun, the recognizable rock formations, the investigators were able to pinpoint the general vicinity where the final photos were taken. The new search was relentless, focused, and utterly grim. They were not looking for a rescue. They were looking for an ending. The discovery of the boot and the memory card had given the Carpenter family something profoundly bittersweet: the certainty of a crime committed and the assurance of her final, valiant fight. The suspense had evolved into a shared, consuming dread. The final question now was not if the killer would be found, but what the retrieval of the pendant, the single most personal piece of evidence recovered, would reveal about the darkness that had finally consumed Shelly Carpenter in the silent, empty heart of the San Juan National Forest. The pendulum of the case had swung violently from a matter of tragic oversight to a meticulously documented act of murder, leaving the investigators with the heavy, terrible knowledge that they were chasing a shadow that had been given a 4-year head start. The image of the silver pendant, digitally restored from the terrifying blur of Shelley's final photograph, became the investigative team's holy grail. It was the only concrete link to the unseen presence that had turned her solitary hike into a desperate flight. The intricate, almost primitive carving on the silver was unique. It suggested a custom piece, perhaps even a one-of-a-kind artifact crafted by a local jeweler or an artisan with a specific cultural connection. The police released the enhanced image to the public, focusing the full, relentless gaze of the media and the community onto this single, small piece of metal. The response was immediate, a flurry of leads that had to be sifted through with painstaking care. Most were dead ends, fueled by speculation and the general human need to solve an open mystery. But then a quiet call came into the tip line, a call that was dismissed initially as another hopeful distraction, yet proved to be the most significant breakthrough of the entire 4-year-old case. The caller was a woman from a small town 2 hours west of the San Juans, a former acquaintance of a man named Jason Keller. She claimed to recognize the pendant. She explained that Keller, a transient worker who had often taken seasonal jobs near the national forest, had once been deeply involved in a fringe, back to the land movement. The pendant, she asserted, was a symbol of that group, handcrafted by one of its members as an exclusive token of membership. The lead was tenuous, relying on a 4-year-old memory of a fringe group, but the investigators, driven by the spectral images on the memory card, pursued it with a quiet, deadly focus. They managed to track down the former artisan of the group, a man now living a conventional, quiet life in New Mexico. He confirmed the story. He had crafted exactly 11 of those pendants, each slightly unique, and he could provide a list of the original recipients. At the top of that list was Jason Keller. This was the moment the narrative truly shifted, transforming from an abstract hunt for an unknown predator into a focused pursuit of a flesh-and-blood suspect. The details of Keller's life were grim, revealing a man with a history of unpredictable behavior, a deeply rooted suspicion of authority, and a pattern of leaving jobs abruptly and relocating without notice. He was a drifter, a ghost who lived on the margins of society, the kind of person who could disappear into the wilderness and leave no trace, the perfect shadow to hide from a crime committed in the empty heart of the forest. The police compiled a comprehensive profile. Keller was not the obvious villain. There were no prior convictions for violent crime, no history of sexual assault, nothing to suggest the cold-blooded malice hinted at by the images on the memory card. His history was one of petty offenses, environmental activism bordering on fanaticism, and a consistent refusal to be tracked or documented. He was a man who prized his anonymity above all else. This only served to heighten the investigators' dread. They were not chasing a career criminal. They were chasing a person who had, for reasons entirely his own, snapped in the wilderness, someone whose crime was perhaps a singular, horrific aberration, making him all the more unpredictable and dangerous. The most critical information that emerged, however, was his current location. Through a combination of old postal records and a quiet, discreet interrogation of his last known associates, the authorities determined that Jason Keller was currently working on a remote privately owned ranch in Wyoming, hundreds of miles away from the crime scene. The immediate tactical decision was to apprehend him. The fear was that the renewed investigation, the sudden media attention on a long, cold case, might spook him, prompting him to vanish once more into the vastness of the American West. The arrest was executed with the same precision and quiet urgency that had defined the entire new investigation. Keller was apprehended without incident. He was quiet, subdued, and offered no resistance. In his remote cabin, investigators found a small personal cache of belongings, including a battered backpack that was quickly sealed and sent for forensic analysis. They also found something far more chilling, a detailed hand-drawn map of the San Juan National Forest, a map with specific small and cryptic markings clustered around the area where Shelly Carpenter's boot had been discovered. The interrogation was a long, frustrating ballet of evasion and denial. Keller admitted to being in the San Juans in August 2001. He admitted to hiking off trail. He even admitted, with a chilling lack of emotion, that he had encountered a young woman taking photographs, but he vehemently denied any violence. He claimed she had simply walked away, disappearing into the very silence the investigators knew had swallowed her. He claimed the pendant, he admitted it was his, must have simply fallen from his neck during their brief interaction. It was the word of a man who was an expert at survival and silence against the spectral evidence of a memory card. But the prosecution had a problem. The emotional weight of the photographs was immense, but emotionally charged evidence, though compelling, does not always equal legal certainty. They had no body, they had no weapon. They had no physical evidence linking Keller to the crime beyond the lost pendant, and his explanation, implausible as it was not impossible. This was the dark underbelly of the entire case. The wilderness had not just hidden the victim, it had almost successfully shielded the perpetrator. The case stalled, caught between the irrefutable emotional truth of Shelley's final moments and the cold, hard requirements of the law. The police needed a body. The family needed closure. The memory card had delivered the chilling how and who, but it had not delivered the where. And without a final location, the story of Shelly Carpenter, despite the Herculean efforts of the investigators and the tragic foresight of the victim, remained incomplete, suspended in a terrible and agonizing limbo. The wilderness, it seemed, was still guarding its darkest secret. The search for Shelly Carpenter's final resting place became an obsession for the investigative team and a torture for her family. They had the killer, or at least the prime suspect, Jason Keller, identified and in custody, yet the core of the case, the corpus delicti, remained elusive. Keller, still maintaining his cool veneer of innocence, refused to cooperate, standing on his claim that the young woman simply vanished after a brief, unpleasant encounter. The vastness of the San Juan National Forest, a wilderness that had betrayed Shelley, was now actively protecting its secrets and, by extension, protecting her assailant. The only hope, the team realized, lay not in the suspect's fractured memory or conscience, but in the physical evidence retrieved from his remote cabin. The battered backpack and the hand-drawn map became the focus of a new, intense forensic analysis. The map was particularly cryptic. It was not a simple hiking guide. It was a personal record filled with tiny, almost invisible notations that seemed to mark not trailheads or lookout points, but isolated specific natural features. One section, corresponding to the remote quadrant where the boot was found, contained a cluster of peculiar markings. A small faded circle next to a symbol that looked remarkably like a small rough tombstone. This was the investigators' 1 in a million chance, a sliver of geographical information buried in a lifetime of wandering. The backpack, however, yielded a more direct yet still deeply disturbing discovery. Forensic technicians meticulously sifting through the layers of dust, pine needles, and dried mud, found microscopic trace evidence, a few strands of long, light brown hair, and what they identified as fine, pink nylon fibers that matched the remnants of the synthetic shell jacket Shelly had been wearing on the day she disappeared, according to archival photos provided by her family. Even more profoundly, they found 2-minute flecks of blood preserved in the deep weave of the canvas, which when tested returned a definitive DNA match to Shelly Carpenter. The evidence was irrefutable. Jason Keller had been in physical, violent contact with Shelly Carpenter. The narrative of her simply walking away was shattered. This new evidence provided the necessary legal leverage. Faced with the DNA evidence, which he knew was undeniable, Keller's composure finally broke. The emotional gravity of the situation, the years of silence, the unblinking photographic evidence, the finality of the DNA, converged, and he offered a confession. It was a story devoid of remorse, told with a chilling detachment that only amplified the tragedy. He recounted the encounter as a simple dispute. He claimed Shelly had been photographing a sensitive private area of the forest, a crude, hidden shelter he had built, and he had confronted her. He insisted the ensuing struggle was an accident, a sudden push where she fell, striking her head on a rock. He described the cold, stark fear of the immediate aftermath, the overwhelming need to make her vanish. The forest, he realized, was not just a place to live. It was a place to hide a crime. He admitted to burying her hastily, selecting a remote, natural depression that he then covered with the seemingly natural arrangement of rocks and fallen timber. He described the location with a spatial clarity that only a person who had labored there and revisited the trauma could possess. It was the same location marked with the tiny tombstone symbol on his map. The chilling detail he volunteered, the one that resonated with the finality of the true crime, was his description of the deliberate act with the boot. He stated that he had removed one of her boots before the burial, a final, cruel flourish of his control over the scene. He had tossed it some distance away, not knowing or caring that the final defiant testament of his victim remained hidden within. His confession, though legally complex due to his mental state, provided the one thing the investigation still desperately lacked: the precise coordinates of the burial site. Armed with this knowledge, the investigators, along with Keller, who was now a silent, shackled guide, returned to the San Juan National Forest. The mood was one of grim determination. The air itself seemed heavy with the weight of 4 lost years. The site, exactly as he described it, was a nearly invisible arrangement of natural debris, an unremarked upon feature in 1,000 acres of rugged wilderness. A single small patch of earth that, once disturbed, revealed a profound and tragic injustice. The excavation was a quiet, solemn procedure, conducted with a reverence that acknowledged the sheer, brutal humanity of the moment. And there, beneath the shallow covering of earth and rock, was Shelly Carpenter. Her remains were recovered, providing the irrefutable evidence that was required to close the legal loop on this horrific chapter. The story, however, did not end with the finding of the body. The forensic analysis of her remains and the grave site provided the final heartbreaking piece of the puzzle, a final definitive answer to the question of how she had died. The forensic pathologist's report refuted Keller's claim of an accidental death from a fall. The analysis revealed that Shelly had suffered defensive wounds and that the final lethal injuries were inconsistent with a simple fall. She had fought, and the manner of her burial, the shallow, hasty covering, was not the act of a distressed man seeking to hide an accident, but the cold, calculated act of a killer seeking to dispose of a victim. Shelly Carpenter, in her final, terrifying moments, had not merely been lost to the mountains. She had been the victim of a calculated, violent act perpetrated by a man who saw her as an intrusion, a threat to his self-imposed, lonely domain. The memory card, the pendant, the backpack, the map, the DNA, every piece of evidence, every step of the protracted, painful investigation had finally led to this single, irrefutable truth. The mountains, silent witnesses for 4 years, had finally been forced to relinquish their secret, delivering both justice and a final, somber closure to a family tormented by the most agonizing question of all. The trial of Jason Keller became the final brutal act in the long, drawn-out tragedy of Shelly Carpenter. The story that unfolded in the courtroom was not just a recital of facts. It was a haunting, linear reconstruction of a young woman's final, desperate flight, played out for a jury and a family who had already lived through the years of agonizing uncertainty. The prosecution's case was built not on conjecture, but on the cold, hard poetry of forensic science, interwoven with the unblinking, silent testimony of the memory card. The evidence was presented in a chronological, step-by-step fashion, adhering to the very same sequence of discovery that had broken the case 4 years earlier. First, the single worn hiking boot, a symbol of the victim's quiet resilience, a time capsule waiting to be found. Then, the memory card, the tiny digital heart of the case, its recovered images projected onto a courtroom screen, the scenic vistas, the subtle shift in focus, and finally, the heartbreaking portraits of Shelly Carpenter's unadulterated fear. It was a narrative of dread, captured by the victim herself, an evidentiary first-person perspective that left an indelible mark on the jury. This was immediately followed by the introduction of the silver pendant, the ghost signature of the killer, which led directly to the identification of Keller. The artisan's testimony recounting the creation of the 11 unique pieces was meticulous and damning. The pieces of the puzzle were locking into place with a horrifying, systematic precision. But the truly devastating blow to the defense came from the microscopic evidence. The DNA match of Shelly's blood on Keller's backpack, the pink nylon fibers, and the forensic pathologist's a report that definitively contradicted Keller's story of an accidental fall. The report, delivered in the precise clinical language of death investigation, outlined the defensive wounds, proof of a desperate fight, and the nature of the head trauma, which was consistent with a focused, violent blow, not a simple slip on a rock. The jury was faced with the unassailable truth: Shelly Carpenter had been brutally murdered after a frantic attempt to escape her assailant. Keller's defense, clinging to the original narrative of an accidental confrontation gone wrong, crumbled under the weight of this scientific certainty. His eventual coerced confession was presented not as an admission of guilt, but as a manipulative, self-serving attempt to minimize the severity of his crime, a final act of control over the victim's narrative. The emotional weight in the courtroom was nearly unbearable. Shelly's family, who had endured the 4 years of emptiness, the sudden shock of the discovery, and the agonizing details of the investigation, now watched as the final, absolute truth was laid bare. The narrative of uncertainty that had defined their lives was finally replaced by the horrific certainty of justice delivered. They were given not the rescue they had once dreamed of, but the vindication of their daughter's final, courageous moments. The jury, after a deliberation that lasted less than a single day, returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. Jason Keller was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The sentence was not just a legal closure, it was a societal reckoning with the darkness that can hide in plain sight, a final acknowledgement that even in the vast, silent, and majestic purity of the wilderness, there is no sanctuary from human malice. The case of Shelly Carpenter, however, left a deeper, more chilling legacy that transcended the simple facts of a murder trial. It became a landmark study in forensic investigation, a textbook example of how a case can be solved not despite the passage of time, but because of a single brilliant and terrifying act of a victim's foresight. The memory card, a piece of technology no larger than a button, had functioned as a digital time capsule, defying the slow erosion of time and nature to deliver a witness statement 4 years late, but utterly intact. It underscored the truth that in the age of omnipresent technology, even the most isolated crime can leave a trail, a ghost in the machine waiting to be retrieved. The image of the boot, sitting half buried in the scrub oak, shielding its vital secret, became a poignant metaphor for the entire case, a quiet container of hope and evidence, waiting patiently for the moment the world would stop and listen. The story of Shelly Carpenter, the hiker who vanished in 2001, is not just a tale of tragedy and murder, but a testament to the enduring power of a single moment of courage. In the face of certain death, she did not succumb to despair. She acted. She concealed her final message, a digital scream that cut through the silence of the San Juans and delivered the man who extinguished her life to the chilling, final justice he deserved. Her story remains a somber and essential chapter in the dark annals of true crime, a testament to the fact that even when the wilderness attempts to swallow the truth whole, a determined spirit and a piece of technology can conspire to bring it back into the light. The echoes of her fear may still linger in the mountain air, but so too does the resounding finality of her victory. The aftermath of the trial brought an unsettling quiet to the San Juan National Forest and a profound, aching finality to the Carpenter family. The case was closed, the verdict delivered, but the lingering questions, the subtle psychological ripples of the crime, continued to spread. Shelly Carpenter's narrative was no longer a mystery. It was a cautionary legend, a dark stain on the otherwise pristine canvas of the American wilderness. The investigators, having lived inside the terror of her final days, were left to process the unsettling realization of how close Jason Keller had come to getting away with murder. Had the amateur metal detectorist Ethan Wells chosen a different day, a different patch of forest, or simply failed to notice the subtle outline of the buried boot, Keller would have remained a free man, a ghost moving among the mountains, his terrible secret intact. The fragility of justice became a key reflection in the post-mortem analysis of the case. It was a victory won not through a traditional police procedural, but by the confluence of the victim's heroic final act and a sheer, unbelievable stroke of chance. The investigative community began to look at the case as a lesson in forensic patience, the understanding that evidence, no matter how small, can survive the elements in the passage of time, waiting for the technology and the dedicated eye to retrieve it. The discussion shifted to the psychology of the perpetrator, the very nature of the malice that had driven Keller. He was a man who sought to remove himself from society, to live a life unobserved and untouched by the rules of the world. Shelly Carpenter, with her camera and her vibrant, documented presence, represented an intrusion, a violation of the pure, anonymous space he had claimed as his own. His act, in his mind, was not merely murder, it was an expulsion, a violent correction of an imbalance. This interpretation, though never fully proven in court, gave the crime a chilling, almost philosophical dimension, the clash between the solitary idealism of the outsider and the ordinary, well-documented life of the modern world. The pendant, the single piece of evidence he left behind, took on a symbolic weight. It was the talisman of his identity, the thing he forgot to discard, a piece of himself that his victim, in her struggle, managed to seize. It was the irony of the case. The man who valued anonymity above all was betrayed by the single most personal item he possessed. The physical landscape of the crime also became a point of quiet, somber reflection. The area where the boot was found and the remote depression where the remains were recovered were treated not as mere geographical locations, but as places of profound historical and emotional significance. They were silent monuments to a final, desperate act. Over time, memorial markers, not officially sanctioned but placed by hikers and well-wishers, began to appear near the trailhead, small testaments to a young woman who went into the woods seeking peace and found terror instead. For the Carpenter family, the life sentence of Jason Keller provided a release from the 4 years of gnawing uncertainty, but the trauma of the knowledge remained. They had the body of their daughter, which allowed for a proper burial, a final public acknowledgement of her life, and a place to grieve. The true closure, they admitted, lay in the narrative of her final moments, the knowledge that she had resisted, that she had fought back, and that she had, in a singular moment of clarity, ensured her own justice. That act of documentation, the hiding of the memory card, transformed her from a simple victim of a random crime into an active participant in the delivery of justice. Her courage, captured in the digital files, was the final, indelible image of the entire case. The story of Shelly Carpenter became a powerful, compelling object lesson for the public, especially for those who seek solace or adventure in the untamed parts of the world. It was a reminder that the greatest danger in the wilderness often walks on two legs, and that a final, defiant act of human will can sometimes pierce the deepest veil of silence. The silent, solemn peaks of the San Juan National Forest still stand, majestic and indifferent, but the story of the solo hiker and the hidden memory card now echoes through their valleys, a perpetual, whispered warning that even the most meticulously concealed truths will eventually find a way to emerge. Her final, terrifying photos remain a potent, enduring artifact of a crime that was nearly swallowed by the earth, but was instead brought to light by the last courageous breath of its victim.